The Zoom congregation. Text, context, consequences. Part 7. After examining the text of the New Testament in relation to the congregations of the first century and considering the historical context in the first 6 parts of this series, we can now ask ourselves whether the claim that we do it the same way as the congregations of the first century can be implemented at all, apart from the fact that we have already recognized from the scriptures that there was not the one congregation. So, after the sections text and context, we are now dealing with the consequences of such a claim. What are the consequences? What is perhaps not so often considered are the consequences of actually trying to implement the pattern of the first century, or rather the patterns. Let us recall Acts 2, the verses 41 to 47. We had read about the beginnings of the Jerusalem congregation. First, that they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching. Second, they broke bread, the Lord's Supper or Eucharist. Third, they shared their meals together. And fourth, they prayed together. And fifth, they shared everything in common. And later there were some changes in the congregation. Now let's see which of these are actually implemented in a Zoom congregation. So remember, the text said they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching. We do that too, of course, something might think now. But let's note that in this quote from the Acts, the 11 faithful apostles were meant. But you will probably also read the letters of Paul or James or Jude, won't you? But we won't quibble. At least as a goal in terms of doctrine, we'll let that pass. It's okay. So the Zoom congregation may be devoted to the apostles' teaching. Fine. There was a second thing, remember? Eating together. Those who say that they do it exactly as the first century congregation might still be able to implement that in their home groups. For a Zoom congregation, however, it is likely to be more difficult and is therefore hardly ever done, having meals together. So just think of it. Everyone has lunch in front of a camera during a meeting. So there we have the first deviation from the pattern of the first century in a Zoom congregation. So you can't do it exactly as they did in the first century. But what about, and that's probably much more important, breaking bread together? So the Lord's Supper in remembrance of Jesus' Last Supper was actually part of the meal eaten together. And so we have the same problem. But for a Zoom congregation, it is even more difficult. Not because of the physical separation, and because you can hardly pass around the same cup and the same bread. Of course you can't. But because of those who are present. Who is allowed to be there and take of the bread and wine? Only the baptized? You remember what we read about in the last episode in the Didache. Or did other requirements have to be met? The New Testament text does not say this clearly, but the Didache clearly states that only those baptized in the name of Jesus may eat. Could someone who was new to the group, to the Zoom congregation, participate in the shared meal and partake of the bread and wine those days and today? Or were they, in the first century, just supposed to watch? What do you do when people regularly attend your Zoom congregation for the first time? Do you have observers, like the Jehovah's Witnesses have? Or are only partakers allowed? Then, of course, there are the questions of what kind of bread and wine should be used. The New Testament says nothing about this. And how does your Zoom congregation do it? Like the congregations in the first century? Or whatever suggestion or rules there are, they cannot be traced back to the congregation in the first century on the basis of the text of the New Testament. The next topic we want to touch is baptism. Are people being baptized in your Zoom congregation? And if so, by whom? Can anyone do it, or only elders? The New Testament reports don't say much, but as with John the Baptist, it was done at a body of water and thus in public. The Didache did provide clear instructions regarding the water, remember? And one should fast beforehand. That's what congregations did in the first century. Well, we do it exactly as in the first century. Then you should ask about the water and the fasting next time. Did anyone in the first century get baptized again because they felt their baptism was invalid? What was baptism about in the first place? What stands in my way of baptism? Asked the Ethiopian in Acts chapter 8. What did he know and why did he want to be baptized? What does the text in the New Testament say? You might be surprised. And that's why we will come back to this later, just in a second. Should a baptism be broadcast worldwide to Zoom congregations via the internet? Remember what you read about it in the New Testament. Who baptized? And what did Paul say on the subject in his first letter to the Corinthians? He wrote, I thank God that I baptized no one of you except Crispus and Gaius, so that no one can say that you were baptized in my name. So if someone has founded a Zoom congregation or congregations, or is known in them, well known, it might be a sign of wisdom to consider whether to baptize others yourself and also broadcast this event worldwide. Which of course was not possible at all in the first century, which brings us back to the topic, we do it exactly the same way as. So let us recall the words of Paul, which we already had read in the second part of this series. Is Christ divided? Was Paul crucified for you? Were you baptized in the name of Paul? I thank God that I did not baptize any of you except Crispus and Gaius, so no one can say that you were baptized in my name. And then he remembers, yes, I also baptized the household of Stephanas. Beyond that, I don't remember if I baptized anyone else. Interesting, Paul doesn't remember if he baptized someone else. That's also interesting if you think about that. What is the importance of baptism for the person and for other persons? So, for Christ did not send me to baptize. That was his argument. But let's go on to another interesting topic. Financing, donations, and personal property. There were and are groups in which members are encouraged to hand over all personal property to the community. Supposedly, this is how the first century in Jerusalem functioned in its early days. However, this is not the case in most Zoom congregations or home groups that I'm aware of. And it was not the case in the other communities in the first century either. So either one adheres to the one or the other congregation in the first century. So early Jerusalem congregation or like other ones like in Antioch, Corinth, Thessaloniki, and so on. But how do you handle donations in your group? In the New Testament, we read that Paul was supposed to think of the poor in Jerusalem. and how donations were organized for these people in need in Judea, because they had become impoverished due to their generosity after Pentecost, persecution, pardon, or natural disasters like famines. And that Paul himself worked in Ephesus and wanted nothing for himself. He only accepted support in exceptional cases. So what do we think of donations for other purposes? If we don't even know the exact reason, only vaguely for the promotion of the activity or support of the activity, or for trips to other people in the group, in the Zoom congregation, in other parts of the country or on the world. Of course, everyone can do it as they want. If the donations are mainly for that and not for the poor, does that still fit with this first century model? We are considering this in view of this statement, we do it in the same way as the first century congregation did. And what we read there was that they donated for the poor and in very few cases for poor people like Paul in certain situations. But even in the first century, the support of traveling preachers, like apostles, or today we would rather call them missionaries, must have been abused frequently. Otherwise, it would not have been mentioned so explicitly in the Didache, as we read in the previous parts of the series. And we read there, every apostle who comes to you is to be received as the Lord, but he is not to stay longer than 1 day, if necessary 2 days. But if he stays 3 days, he is a false prophet. As a Jehovah's Witnesses, which I was in the past, I should have read this to a circuit or regional overseer. That would have been an interesting discussion. But perhaps if you're still Jehovah's Witness, you may use that text from the first century, and let's see what the reaction will be. Okay, let's come to another interesting topic. Apostles, overseers, elders, and deacons. I'll ask it straight out. Are there apostles in your Zoom congregation? Overseers, elders, deacons? If they exist, then that doesn't if they don't exist, then that doesn't correspond to the congregations in the first century. The text in the New Testament is unequivocal. And if they do exist, so elders, how are they appointed? By laying on the hands by the apostles? Hardly, because they have been dead for a long time. Or by the Holy Spirit? In what way? Or are elders elected by the congregation? This is where it gets quite difficult, because we find nothing in the New Testament about this after the death of the apostles, the original ones, and even those like Paul and Barnabas. I will not go into this part in more detail, because the Zoom congregations and house churches of which I'm aware of do not follow the example of the first century in this regard. They want to be organized differently. Everyone should be equal, perhaps also because of painful experiences in a religion to which they previously belonged. But it's crystal clear. In the New Testament, the congregations in the first century had elders and deacons. We read that in the first parts of this series. Now let's come to a topic which is related and even more interesting. Could women be overseers, elders, and deacons? This is an exciting topic because there are still heated discussions among scholars and lay people as to whether women are allowed to be overseers, elders, and deacons, and how the relevant texts are to be understood. Don't think for a moment that we can clear this up in a few sentences here. This topic shows, however, that it's not so easy to do it exactly as in the first century if you don't know for sure how it was handled back then. And possibly even differently due to the cultural and historical context in the different congregations. Besides, the topic is interesting because you can't just ignore it, unless there are only, for example, men in a Zoom community or in a Zoom congregation, which would be rather unusual and certainly not in line with first century congregations where men and women were present. What if women are present and some have the understanding that women may be overseers or pray, but others are convinced of the opposite? What does the Zoom congregation do then? Do some have to accept the decision in favor of the other view? Who decides this then? The majority of those present, i.e. those who are regularly present, or those who happen to be present, or the overseers? If there are any overseers or elders at all, which is often not the case, or the founder. So, or was it the person who founded the Zoom congregation, started it, organized it, or moderates it? That person has the right to decide who may enter the house, doesn't he? Oh, that's the thinking some people have. Oh, that's like my house, so I can decide these things. But if we think about that, so then Prisca and her husband Aquila, would they have had the right to decide who may enter the meeting in their house, in the congregation? And according to Romans 16, verses 3-5, the congregation was in their house. And they decided what would be taught and whether women would be allowed to pray, etc. I understand that someone who organizes a Zoom meeting initially sees it as an invitation to their living room. But then it is not a congregation like the disciples in the first century. It's not a congregation as those we read about in the New Testament. Then it's something else. Some believers in your living room. But these are by no means all the challenges faced when growing a Zoom community. A few more, and the conclusion will follow in the next and final episode of this series. Thank you very much for watching and listening. Goodbye.